Today we will be talking about Ebola versus the influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919. The similarities between these two diseases are their demographics, and they both originated from animals. The difference between the influenza epidemic of 1918 and Ebola are their movements and how the diseases were contained, and the mortality rate between influenza epidemic of 1918 and Ebola. Before we get into this lecture, I will give a conflict summary of these diseases. The influenza epidemic was a disease that occurred in 1918 and 1919. This disease had symptoms like the common flu. It infected over 500 million people worldwide, and 20 to 50 million people died in this disease. Later on, the influenza epidemic died down. Scientists figured out why it had killed millions of people. The reason was the disease directly went into your lungs and created pneumonia that led to many deaths worldwide. Ebola is one of the deadliest diseases in current human history. This particular type of disease is from an animal but is spread by human to human contact. The first outbreak of Ebola was in Central Africa, but the most recent outbreak of this deadly virus was in West Africa. Ebola and the influenza epidemic of 1918 are both some of the deadliest and life-costly diseases in human history. The diseases have shown how resilient the scientists of today and of the past are. Now, to continue on about talking about these, I will compare the diseases now. Ebola and the influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919 both affected the demographic of the population in many ways. The influenza epidemic had a quote mortality rate in the 1976 outbreak was 92%. In comparison, the mortality rate in the Ebola Sudan outbreak that same year was 53.5%. Unquote. The mass casualties that Ebola caused affected the way the public around those areas of the world had to function because the government had to worry about this infectious disease. As you can see in this chart, in the most recent Ebola outbreak, there was months where it was almost 81% death rate. If you got the disease, you were going to die. You had an 80% chance of dying in March. In April, it went down to 50, so it was a 50-50 shot. In May, it went down to 35. Then it went back up in June and July. Now, going on to the influenza epidemic mortality in America and Europe during 1918 and 1919. The influenza epidemic had a similar situation. The epidemic was a major demographic event in the United States and worldwide. It was notable for its over 20 million deaths worldwide, approximately half a million in the United States. The millions of deaths around the world in the United States causes the governments around the world to have to turn their attention to huge problems at hand. Ebola and the influenza epidemic of 1918 changed how many governments had to operate because large decreases in populations were causing basic social functions to break down. As you can see in this map, in this chart right here, the lines are different states, big cities in the respected country. In Europe, right here, this straight line, the death count, the death percentage skyrockets to 60%. And then in Paris, it skyrockets to 60% in October throughout November. As we compare these diseases further, I am going to be comparing the way these diseases were transmitted and started. Ebola and the influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919 come from animals such as birds and bats. In these two pictures right here, both of these diseases could have came from either one of these creatures, ducks or bats. They both were transmitted through human to animal contact. Some flying animals, such as bats, carry both diseases. Bats carried the diseases and transferred it to humans, and other animals can possibly transmit these diseases. These diseases both came from animals like bats and birds. Ebola and the influenza epidemic are originated from animals that can carry the diseases without being infected, but can transmit it to humans and eventually cause them to catch this disease and make it blow up worldwide like the Spanish flu did. Now we will be talking about the differences between these two deadly diseases. In this map right here, this is the most recent Ebola outbreak, which was in 2014 through 2016. Okay? Ebola spread throughout West Africa but was fairly contained. And the differences between Ebola and the influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919 was the way they were contained. Ebola was contained to mainly Central Africa and West Africa. In this map, you can see the confirmed cases of Ebola are mainly in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and other neighboring countries. The Ebola's first outbreak was 70% death rate. It is said that Ebola had a year. The number of confirmed cases is 10,141. Probable and suspected cases of Ebola virus have been reported primarily in 5 countries, like the ones I just listed: Sierra Leone, Liberia, Nigeria, Senegal, Syria, and other neighboring countries around it. Now I will show you how these two diseases were different in the way they were contained. The Spanish flu around the world. 1918 Spanish flu was around the world. 50 million deaths worldwide, as you can see on this chart, and over 500,000 deaths in the United States alone. The Spanish flu was said to have originated in the China region because China had sent workers to Europe to help make and aid their militaries in World War II. The influenza epidemic was a disease that made its way through the world, including the United States, and killed millions of people. The disease traveled fast because the way they were transmitted. Any type of contact with an individual who has either Ebola or the influenza epidemic of 1918, such as person-to-person contact. The Spanish flu is a highly contagious epidemic that originated in 1918. And according to one of my sources, the India census, person-to-person contact would infect you with the Spanish flu, and the Spanish flu was the deadliest disease at this point in history because there was no cure and no scientist could make a cure. Both diseases are transmitted through person-to-person contact, and both of them as also had no cure with when the first outbreak occurred. These diseases differed in how they were contained and their interaction with people and movement. Another difference in these two deadly diseases is the death rate of them. The Spanish flu is worse than the death rate of Ebola. The influenza epidemic was worse than Ebola because the world was not as technologically advanced as it was when the first outbreak happened. There is not a real correct number of deaths that occurred in the influenza epidemic, but the estimated number of deaths is 20 to 50 million because of the influenza epidemic. In the end, the influenza epidemic was way worse than Ebola because there was many more deaths in the world, and the world was not technologically advanced as it was in the 21st century. This is my source cited page.